We're having a presentation on a perspective of directly elected mayor and its benefits and challenges from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. It does give me great pleasure to have with us this morning the most senior civil servant in that department, Secretary General Graham Doyle, who is Sec-Gen at the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Graham is a former Secretary General at the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, a former Chief Executive Officer of CEO of Waterford Airport. Graham has, obviously, it mightn't be that obvious for some, but has had a very wide range of responsibilities. And we're very grateful that Graham could be with us this morning to talk about his brief in relation to local government. I'd also like to mention that Graham is accompanied today by a senior official within the local government with expertise, Anya Ní-Bhríon, and Anya will join Graham later on to answer some questions. So it gives me great pleasure, and please give a warm welcome to Secretary General Graham Doyle.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you all this morning, and like Bertie did, I'd also like to really thank you all for the time you're giving to consider this really important matter. And look, I hope you've had some good discussions in the previous weekends of this and this weekend, and I think there's one more as well. So look, I'd really like to thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. I suppose around some of the history of how the thinking around some of this stuff has developed, and Bertie certainly gave you a strong sense of that as well. And then I suppose one that my department has worked on more recently is obviously the Limerick Mayor, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Anya Ní-Bhríon will join me just for the questions and answer session, because if you're a very senior civil servant in charge of a massive big brief, it's always really important that you bring somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. So I've done that with Anya this morning. I'd particularly like to thank Jim and Art for putting me as an official who will naturally have a more sort of anodyne set of views right after Bertie Ahern. Thank you guys for that. That's very helpful. So look, local government, it's very much at the heart of I suppose of many of the functions delivered by the state. I have, as I say, a very, very broad government department, from housing to and all the aspects of housing, whether we're dealing with social or affordable housing or the wider housing market, the huge problem and the huge challenge that we have as a country with issues like homelessness. We've got water infrastructure, we've got the whole local government sector, we've got the fire and emergency piece. Within all of that, we've got the heritage function, and I even get to be responsible for the weather, because we've got Met Erin with us as well, and I'd like to take due credit for that today. But it's a massive and broad government department, and as I say, with a very, very large budget now, the largest in the history of the state, particularly going into an area like housing. But what we do is delivered in partnership with the local government sector, and the work that they do is, and they get criticised a lot, and sometimes rightly so, but the work that's done within the system is incredible. There's some really incredibly hard-working people, and no more, I think, than during the COVID pandemic and the way the local government sector stepped up with a range of really citizen-focused initiatives, and how they helped us reopen the economy again. And I came to this department about 2 years ago. I'm not a career civil servant. I spent a lot of time in the private sector. I was a management consultant for a long time with PwC, and then the rest of the career history. So it's been interesting to come from both sides of, to come from a private sector side, to come from a kind of a business advisory side, and then into government, and I've worked with local government, I suppose, throughout that career in various ways. So look, I know you've had some presentations from a variety of speakers and over the last couple of weekends, and I suppose the diversity of different local government systems, and there really is a huge diversity in the roles and responsibilities and powers of directly elected mayors found in, I suppose, a variety of jurisdictions, operating, as I say, in a range of differing governance systems under different legal codes and in an array of political cultures. There's no settled or ideal model in terms of how to do this, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all. All cities are different, and I suppose that whole issue of urbanisation and the power and draw of cities and how you run them is one that, you know, it exercises a huge amount of academic thinking throughout the world. Quite often, a lot of the academic material is very much focused on really large cities around the world, and sometimes it's a little harder. I know there was certainly attempts previously to try and set, you know, Dublin as and the size of that city in that context. So I know, look, you've spoken with the Mayor of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Andy Burnham, and look, he has some really rich experience around his time as Mayor. Auckland, with its single executive serving the overall council, as well as constituent local boards. Another very useful example. You know, another example may be the area metropolitana de Barcelona, which has a representative council from the constituent municipalities, led by a president appointed by the Assembly, and that's by tradition of the Mayor of Barcelona. All of these differing systems all provide examples. There isn't a single transferable example, but there are learnings, I think, that you can take, and hopefully you've had some of the opportunities to do that. I suppose, you know, I'll state the obvious. Dublin is a unique city within a unique country, and I suppose while those international comparisons, they enlighten and guide at the end of the day, you know, any proposed model for local government in Dublin, it must think about the particular needs, the opportunities, the risks, the features of Dublin, and I suppose the proper local, national and international context that is set within. So if I talk about local government in Ireland, just to set that as a context, we've got 31 local authorities, each with an elected council and a chief executive who's appointed following an open competition. 4 of those 31 local authorities are in the county of Dublin. We know all what they all are. Although we should also, I suppose, acknowledge that the functional area of Dublin really does spread beyond Dublin and into neighbouring counties, and I think that's a significant factor when we look at the delivery of services. So nationally, we have a total of 949 councillors, with 183 of those elected to the 4 Dublin local authorities, and I think it's fantastic that there are a number of those individuals here to share those experiences with you as well, and some of that direct experience of working with and in local government. If we look at Dublin, the 4 local Dublin authorities are very significant in terms of the overall structure. If you look at the figures for 2020, it's a little bit misrepresentative to a certain degree in terms of it being a COVID year. But if you look, about 25% of the overall spend of local authorities, which is not far off the 7 billion mark, about 25% of that, more than 25% of that, I think it's about 1.7 billion in 2020, came from the 4 local Dublins. So Dublin is a particular pull or a particular big beast in the context of local government, when we take it as a whole, and that's something, an obvious point, but it strongly impacts the conversation around local government, you know, with about a quarter of the national population and all of that. The functions in local authorities, I'm sure you've had presentations on this, but there's this idea of the reserved functions, which are reserved for decision by the council. So they set the policy, they set the budget, they appoint the local authority chief executive, and then all other functions fall under the chief executive, and they're called executive functions. But the chief executive carries those out within an overall policy context, the policy of the council, and indeed some of the national policies and procedures that are implemented in that case. So the council will set that overall policy and strategic direction, including in particular the responsibility for a balanced budget and the county development plan. And I suppose if we look at that funding, and again, all of this has been touched on in all your previous presentations, I think some of that very much comes from local sources. Some of it's that equalisation mechanism that was referred to earlier on around the issue of local property tax. A lot of it, a big chunk of it, maybe depending on how you measure it, maybe in the order of 40% comes from government departments, all government departments, and each government department works with the local authorities in their own right to deliver their programmes through the local authorities. So I'm accountable for my overall budget and the bits that go to local government. Another big funder of local government would be the Department of Transport, but all local government or all government departments, to some degree, I would say, I think I'd be reasonably confident saying all government departments will have some sort of a scheme that works through local government. If we look at local government and the functions that and the services it provides to citizens, there is a big list. It's actually over 1,000 services, would you believe, that are delivered to citizens through local government. So I suppose, look, in government, or in Dublin, local government really, it represents the outcome of a process of evolution and reform that's really been going on since the foundation of local government itself. We're going back through, the Local Government Dublin Act in 1993, which put in place Fingal, South Dublin, Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, and dissolved, as Bertie said earlier, Dublin County Council. And I suppose there was about a decade of work involved in that, and a really substantial reorganisation of local government in the country. And I suppose its intention was to ensure a more relevant and accessible local government structures with sharper focus and operational capability to serve their areas. And again, this I think is what Bertie was talking about, and not just the person of the mayor, but I suppose the system. The Local Government Act in 2001, it included provisions for the direct election of local authority Cathaoirleach, who would have served their roles for a full local government term of 5 years. It was considered that this could be a first step on the road to giving an executive role to local authority Cathaoirleach. The provisions of that were never given force to and repealed in 2003 on the basis of other reforms that took place in the local government sector at the time, such as the abolition of the dual mandate, for example. And it was considered at the time that this needed time to bed down. 2010, Minister John Gormley introduced a bill which proposed a Dublin Regional Authority with planning, waste management, water and transport responsibilities to be led by a directly elected mayor. That legislation collapsed with the dissolution of the Doyle in 2011. Another attempt then to introduce a directly elected mayor for Dublin in the Local Government Reform Act 2014. And again, I suppose that this required all 4 Dublin local authorities to pass a resolution allowing for a plebiscite in Dublin, but that wasn't adopted at the time. So, I won't keep going with that history, and Bertie gave a sense of it as well, but there have been a number of efforts to get to the point where this can be brought on. Where it has and is being brought on in terms of a directly elected mayor is in Limerick. So, commitment in the 2016 programme for a partnership government, policy paper on local authority directly elected mayors with executive functions was agreed by government, and we know subsequently that there were plebiscites held in Limerick, Waterford and in Cork City in mid-2019, and only the people of Limerick voted in favour of establishing that directly elected mayor with executive functions, and a bill is currently at an advanced stage of drafting to give effect to that decision, and ultimately the government will then decide on the timing of that election. We've worked a lot in this department, and Orna, who will join me later, has worked significantly on this. And in terms of sort of the debates around what levels of functions, what types of government functions are there, and if you look at some of the academic research, which I happened to have an opportunity to look at recently, you can see that there is a tension, and Bertie referred to it earlier, and some of the questioners referred to it, around the devolving of functions. And I think someone asked who's the barrier to that? Is it politicians or is it civil servants? I suppose sometimes it can be personality, sometimes it can be look, everybody will have a view and all of that. Sometimes there are real technical issues, or not technical issues, but real issues in terms of how services might be provided. And if you look at, it was a London School of Economics study that I looked at a couple of weeks ago, that it shows, I suppose, the balance of some of the services that are delivered to citizens, and to what end of the spectrum are they delivered at a national government level and at a local government level. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but those debates happen all over the world, and the mix is a little different, but there are some broad trends. And again, Bertie, I think, referred to some of the challenges in all of that. Whatever system you go with in these, there are advantages and disadvantages, and sometimes it comes full circle, and what you've done many years ago, you end up maybe looking at again in a different set of circumstances many years later. Broadly speaking, though, in terms of the mayoral proposal for Limerick, is that the mayor will be assigned the executive functions. The council will still operate in the way it operates at the moment, but the mayor would have the executive functions. And he would also still be a member of the elected council. So a Director General would replace the Chief Executive, and the Chief Executive would support the Mayor and be responsible, he or she would be responsible for the day-to-day running of the local authority, staffing matters, etc. Would also be responsible for decision-making in relation to individual cases, allocations, enforcement matters, and so on, still being guided in the context of the overall policy direction of the council. The mayor would be accountable to the elected council, and obviously also directly answerable to the electorate. So, look, the introduction of the directly elected mayor politically was very much seen as a significant change in local government, a really significant change in local government, in the sense of bringing that direct electoral accountability. It was considered that that would enhance the profile of Limerick, that it would enhance transparency and accountability, and I suppose improve access to national government and decision making that impacts on Limerick. And bear in mind now that Limerick is a unitary local authority. It consists of the areas of the former Limerick City Council and County Council, which were merged in 2014. So we've already seen, I suppose, a lot of change in how Limerick functions and operates. And obviously, I suppose the geographic area in Limerick is probably a little bit more defined than in the case of Dublin, but in itself, obviously, is an important regional centre. So at its heart, lots of new functions due to be assigned to the mayor, a few new functions to be assigned to the mayor. The reform is really more about the transfer of executive functions from an appointed official to a directly elected office holder. I'm very conscious that I have to be a little bit careful about giving my personal opinion to you, and I don't want to guide you. This is for you to decide, but I would suggest that I suppose that model wouldn't necessarily lend itself to Dublin, which is a little bit more complex. It would really mean a very significant change in the government structures put in place previously. So I've lots of stuff here in relation, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. Around local government reform in Dublin and how that has come about and what the thinking behind it was. But what I will say is, you know, some of that thinking has really been around the concept of strong leadership that can be exercised by a mayor with a large direct democratic mandate and a strategic policy formulation role with improved, we talked about accountability earlier, and just greater connectivity between communities and local government, and being able to stand as a champion for their city in the context of, in a national context. I might just mention, it's a decade old, and it was mentioned earlier, the putting people first piece of work. I suppose it identified a number of issues in the context of directly elected mayor for Dublin, which I think probably remain valid and possibly could be considered as part of your work. I suppose, again, it was this idea of championing and setting a vision for Dublin. It suggests that some of the functions could be substantial and strategic, so in the space of transport, economic and spatial strategy, and possibly into other areas. And we touched on, you know, again, whether at what end of the spectrum, areas like education and policing and emergency planning, and some of those issues, again, many of them, they go from one end of the spectrum to the other in terms of what tends to be delivered locally and what tends to be delivered nationally. So again, a lot of work around that piece. I'm going to skip it in the interest of time just to get to the questions and answers later. But let me just, as I say, I've got a lot of detail, but we might touch on that later. So look, I'll just conclude by again thanking the Chair and the Assembly members for the invitation to speak with you today. I think it's an exciting time for local government in Ireland, and some of the things they've been involved in over the last number of years, and some of the work that they've done. I think the mandate you've been given here is a really important one in the context of Dublin and Dublin, I suppose, as a driver nationally of our overall performance as a country. So I wish you very well in your deliberations. I know you're going to break out shortly, and look forward to answering some of your questions when we get around to that in a while. Thank you.